So with the water pump in, we can get the balance shaft chain on. This chain drives not only the valve shafts, but also the water pump. That's why we had to get the water pump on first. So I've got our new chain here. I'm using a Chloe's kit. Now, GM has two similarly colored links. That's these two black links. And then the unique one is gold on this Chloe's. It looks like step one is you put the uniquely colored link on the timing mark of the intake balance shaft. And you see the timing marks on these are these little arrows. Hopefully that's showing up on camera. It's just a little arrow pointing up. And then the instructions say you work clockwise, and you take, let's get that kind of in place. Take the first matching link and line it up with the timing mark on the crank. And get this to kind of stay a little bit. So we're going to work clockwise around and put the first matching link onto the crank mark. Let me show you guys what that looks like. You can see it's right here. There we are. Next we're going to go around the water pump. Obviously it's not timed. A little tricky working around the camera. There we go. A little bit of a pain, so we're going to make sure we still got the timing mark on the crank lined up. Now we're going to make sure we have the other matching link on the right spot of the balance shaft, exhaust balance shaft. There we go. Looks like the ticket was to first align both the balance shaft marks, get it around the water pump, and then you go back and push it back up onto the crank sprocket. That makes it a lot easier than trying to do this one last I mean. So now we're just going to make sure all the marks are still where they need to be. Got the unique mark on the intake balance shaft. Got the similar mark on the crank sprocket mark. And we've got the last similarly marked chain link to the exhaust mark. So now we should be ready to get all of the guides in and the tensioner. We're going to start with this upper guide. Goes in like that. And all the guide bolts, I'm going to put a little bit of Loctite on them just to hold them in for a little extra insurance. I'm going to come back and torque all of the guide bolts at once to spec once we have them all in place. Next we're going to get this guide in place. You can see there the crank sprocket had come forward a little bit, so this chain wasn't sitting into its groove. So that's one thing to check. You want to make sure this is seated back all the way, and you want to make sure the chain goes into its groove between the two raised edges on the guides. Lastly, we're going to get the tensioner guide in place. The spec on the guide bolts is 11 foot-pounds. Oh, it didn't take the threads with it, it broke the bolt. Even better. That's awesome. Well, now we have to deal with this broken bolt that's in here. It felt weird, I should have stopped, but, you know, you gotta learn your lesson 1,000 times, I guess. At least I do. Wonder if welding onto it is probably the way to go. It's pretty small for an easy out or anything like that. Let me see if I've got a small easy out. If not, then we may be welding. So it doesn't look like I've got an easy out small enough for this little M6 bolt. I think what I'm going to do is just take the balance shaft chain off again and weld the bolt up enough that I can weld a nut on it. It shouldn't be in there very tight. This bolt is so small, and it wasn't like it was seized in there initially, it just broke off. So we should be able to get that out pretty easily. If the threads are all messed up, I luckily have an M6x1 helicoil set in stock, so we can do that if we need to. I am going to have to run to the junkyard, I guess, and grab a timing chain guide bolt for this thing, which is annoying. But it is what it is. It's what you get when you're an idiot like me. So let's get this chain off and get it set up to weld on. Alright, I've got everything kind of covered up. We're going to find out, I guess, if this blanket's made of cotton or not. It's an old rag, not a blanket. Just obviously don't want spatter getting on anything. Critical. Alright, it does look like I'm almost out of wire, so odds are I'm going to have to go run to the store and get more, but... Yep, just got the Harbor Freight 90 amp flux core going. You know, the $99 special one. That's a piece of garbage, but it works for stuff like this. I've gotten many stuck bolts out with it. So let's see how well this blanket or rag burns, I guess. Okay, well, we've got a bead built up enough that it's out of the surface. It looks like this rag's actually done pretty good. So that's good. So I'm gonna go grab a little nut and see if we can weld it on there. Okay, well, let's see. Ooh, just broke off. Nice. Ooh. Take two. Okay, well, I guess it does seem like it's cotton, because if it were polyester or something, it'd be burning through big time. At least from my experience. I'm gonna go grab another nut. Let's give this another go. Maybe. am gonna stuff this down in here. Well, paint just keeps stuff from falling in there. Let's see if we can get this out. It's spinning. Alright, let me grab a real wrench. Well, we got it to come out some. Lots of welding spatter. We're gonna have to clean this out really well. That's okay. Alright, let's get the surgery gown back on. Just another go. Okay, should be sticking out enough for a nut. Oh. Nice. Awesome. That's why you want some real welding blankets. But these are what I got, so that's what I'm using. Okay. Take 3. Bit more for good luck. Seems like the water helped. A little bit more. Cool down a touch. Guess we can do this. Okay, I've got a new wire loaded up. So, let's get everything protected again. Alright, should be good to go. It's not a great. Well, it doesn't look like. Let's see. Well, that's enough to get a nut started. Alright, let's give that a go. Seem decent-ish. Seems pretty solid. Could get a bigger nut. Oop. It's feeling pretty good. Kind of feels like it's taking the threads with it, but we'll see. Hopefully not. Not a huge deal if it is, though. We can just helicoil it. Yep, I see. Well, weird. Looks like it's the bolt threads that are kind of rounded off, weirdly enough. Welding spatter is exactly the kind of crap you don't want getting down into your oil pan. So I'm going to be very careful to not drop any down in there. Let me stuff some paper towels in there. There's that we welded the nut on. You can see how helpful a welder can be, even if it's just a crappy one like this, for this kind of situation. It's worth it just for getting stuck bolts out. I think we'll get the air gun, just to make sure there's nothing still on here. You know what, I probably should have taken this off fully. It's kind of stupid on my part, but we're looking okay, I think. Yep. Yep. Alright, cool. I think I am going to grab a tap for this hole, run it through there, see if we can get a bolt to torque up to spec in there, and if it is, then we'll get everything reinstalled after cleaning it out, I guess. So it should be a M6 by 1.0 thread. Test at one of these holes. Yeah, it seems to thread in just fine. Felt pretty decent. You see it cut some. You do see the threads in there, they look okay. Dropped a little bit of shavings, we're gonna have to blow this out pretty good. Let me fire up the air compressor so we can blow the hole out and the rest of this thing. Okay, we should be good. Let's try threading in a bolt. Feels pretty good. Let's see if it'll torque down. Alright, got 132 inch-pounds, which is 11 foot-pounds. Yeah, it's torquing out. So I think we narrowly avoided having to helicoil it, which is always a good thing. I'm gonna give this all one last blowout, then we'll put the chain back in place. Okay, we should be good now. I don't see any welding spatter. There was a little bit that got caught by the paper towel, so that's good. Put that back in place just so we don't drop any bolts or anything down there. Alright, I think we're good to get the chain back in place. So, start with the gold link. This thing. Cool. I did reapply Loctite on those. So since we broke that one bolt, I am going to have to leave one bolt out. I'll probably leave it out of one of the cam timing chain guides, and I'll run to the junkyard tomorrow and get the part we need. Alright, should be good to go there. Mark them with the paint marker. Let's double check all our timing marks again. Should be good to go. And now we can get the tensioner guide on. And this one only gets torqued to 89 inch-pounds. Make sure everything's seated in its groove. Which actually this chain is not. Okay, now our balance shaft chain and guides are all in. So the next thing we can put in is the tensioner. Our kit came with a new one, so that's what we're going to use. You can see it's got this little pin, basically, that just keeps it from extending, so that it's easy to install. I'm going to have to go grab the bolts from the old tensioner. These get torqued down to 89 inch-pounds. And I just realized I forgot to put Loctite on these. I'll take them out and put some on. Alright, now we're just going to remove this clip, locking the balance shaft tensioner. I'm going to double check that all our timing marks are correct. Everything still looks good, so with that, our balance shaft chain is good to go. Okay, so now with that, we can move on to the timing chain. So the first thing I'm going to do is remove this cam actuator bolt. Use one wrench up here. So now the cams are supposed to have their notches pointing out like this and this. This one we left like that because when it's at the proper position there's tension on one of the exhaust valves. So we had it like that so they could all be closed so that we didn't bend any. But now we can go ahead and set it to the proper position. Here's the picture in the service manual for anybody following along. And again, I'll try to link the service manual in the description if anybody finds it useful. That should be approximately where we need it. And we already have the crank at cylinder number 1, top dead center. So now we're just going to make sure we have the timing gear on properly. Looks like we're good to go there. New chain. We should have a similar deal to the balance shaft chain, with the 2 light colored links and 1 uniquely colored link. So the intake cam is the one that gets the uniquely colored link, which it doesn't look like. Looks like on this chain, all we have are gold. But it should be pretty easy to tell because the two cam sprockets are obviously closer to each other than the crank. So this is obviously going to be the crank sprocket. This will be the intake since these both have to face out. And this will be the exhaust. Let's see if we can get through down below. There's a couple little knobs that stick out inside the head. That can be a little tricky to get the timing chain over. But there we go. So we have the two close colored links up here for the cams, and we have the gold link down here for the crank. I need to pop the crank bolt out. Hopefully it's not in here too tight. That's turning the engine. Okay. Alright, so I stood here for a second wondering why things didn't line up, and I realized there's something I overlooked. This is a 2012 model year engine. I have the service manual for a 2010 Equinox, which is basically the same, except this is an LEA 2.4 Ecotec, and I believe in 2010 they had the LAF, if I remember right. So, because of that difference, this is how the cams need to be clocked. So I'm going to go ahead and rotate this. We are going to need to be careful to make sure no valves hit the pistons, but just by looking at the cam lobes up here, we should be okay, because the only pistons that are at risk of having valves hit are the ones at top dead center, which is number 1 and number 4. Number 4 is going to be just traveling on the base circle. Let me get you guys up here so you can see. Number 4 is just traveling on the base circle because we're going to rotate it counterclockwise. So we should be good there. And then number 1 will be just fine because we're going to be coming up to where it needs to be. But even still, we're going to keep in mind that we need to avoid any kind of resistance. If we feel any kind of, oh my gosh. But even with that, I'm still going to keep in mind that any resistance is not good, so let's just go ahead and rotate the cam over. You know, it may actually be hitting cylinder number 1 piston. So, because of that, I think we're going to need to rotate the engine just slightly, which is annoying because it's going to mess it up a little bit. But rotate it just enough that cylinder number 1 goes down in its hole a little bit. Okay, all pistons should be down about halfway now. So let's go ahead and try moving the cam again. There we go. Perfect. So now I'm going to rotate the crankshaft back around. To verify we're at top dead center, I'm going to just look down the hole. And you can look at the crank key. So we should be good now. I did notice on inspection of the cam actuators that these are a little bit worn. I mean, this is a 160,000 mile engine, so that's to be expected. You see the tips of the teeth are just a little rounded over. There's kind of a sharp edge on the side. So I decided to just go ahead and order some new ones. These would probably work no problem, but that's okay. Plus the new ones came with a new bolt, and you have to use a new cam actuator bolt because it's a torque to yield bolt. If you reuse it, you're not going to get the right clamping force. So now we can see our arrow is pointing in the right direction. Before, the problem is this was down here. So this would be like that. And you can see the timing mark is not pointing in the right direction. But now that we have that fixed, put that on the cam. Alright, now that we've got the intake cam on properly, I'm just going to go ahead, thread this bolt in so it doesn't come out. I did use Dorman branded VVT actuators because they were a decent price. They seemed to have good reviews. And they had next day shipping from Amazon. Put the link in the description if you guys are interested. A lot of guys, I've heard a lot of people rag on Dorman, but to be honest with you, I've used a lot of their parts and I've never had issues. So that's just my experience. But now that this is all aligned, we're going to go ahead, get the chain link onto the crank marker. There's just a little dot right there. Pretty faint. Hopefully it's showing up. But you can see its approximate position. It should be pretty obvious. So I am also going to slide the tensioner guide up in here. Yep, came off the crank. So you gotta hold the chain in place to make sure it doesn't go out of place. And I'm just gonna rotate the crank a little bit to take slack out of the chain so that it doesn't fall off again. I don't have to actually turn anything, but just take up the slack. Now that will stay, let's get some Loctite on this bolt, and then we can get it torqued down to spec. This gets torqued down to 89 inch-pounds. Now, finally, we can get the exhaust actuator in place. Same exact story as the intake. You can see there's this arrow in between the two raised bosses. That obviously goes to the colored part of the chain. You want to make sure the chain is seated in on the guide. Looks like the exhaust cam is a little bit off and we need to rotate a little bit. Not a huge deal. Let's get the wrench on the hex part of the cam. See, it likes to snap a little bit, but you just gotta carefully get it in place. There is a holder tool you can get, which is helpful, but especially if you're doing it in the car. But since we're doing it off, there's no problem with us doing it like this. It's just a little bit more annoying. Probably going to be easier actually if we take this off initially. Get it lined up like that. Yeah, that's the ticket. There we go. Then we just rotate the cam to match up. Get the bolt back in. Now we should be good. You can see down here we got slack on the chain, which is exactly where we want it. You want this side to be taut, this side to be slack, because this is where the tensioner goes in, and it will take all of that up. So you can see we got a gold mark to the arrow, another gold mark to the arrow, and our gold link down here is still on the mark for the crank. So we should be good to get the tensioner in now. Actually, before we get the tensioner in, we've got a couple more guides to put in. We've got this one that goes along here on the right side, left side I guess if it was in the car. We've got a little oil sprayer here to put in that keeps the chain lubricated, and then there's an upper guide for right here. We're going to start with this one. So ordinarily this guide is held in with 2 shoulder bolts just like the other guides, but apparently on these Ecotecs this upper shoulder bolt is a common place of failure. So there's this bolt you can get that goes in through here, which normally just an access cover, but it actually slots in to the guide and holds it like that. So I went ahead and got it. It was like $8. I think this is also a dormant part. I'll put the link in the description for anybody who's interested. And then obviously the lower bolt is still the regular shoulder bolt. Alright, so both of the fixed guide bolts get torqued to 106 inch-pounds. That's true for both the lower one and the upper one if you're retaining that upper one. If not, then this holds it in like I mentioned earlier. Alright, so next we'll do the upper guide. Just bolts in like that. These get torqued down to 89 inch-pounds. Next we're going to install our new tensioner. I don't have the correct metric socket for it, but 1.25 inch fits perfectly. I don't remember what the metric conversion for that is, but I'm sure you can figure it out. This gets torqued down to 55 foot-pounds. Now, if you're reusing the tensioner, there is a specific reset process that you have to do. It's probably okay to reuse it, but most kits come with them, so there's not a lot of reason to. Because if you're in here, you might as well reset the timing set, or replace the timing set, since that's a big failure point on these engines. Okay, so to release the locking pin on the tensioner, we're going to need to wait till we have the balancer on, so for now we are good to go. We're just going to verify that our timing marks are all still correct. Which it seems to be. Make sure our chains are all seated properly in their guides. Which they are. So we can call that a successful timing chain installation. One last thing we need to do is install our oil squirter. The kit I got comes with a new one, so I'm going to go ahead and use that. This bolt also gets torqued down to 89 inch-pounds. Also, before we torque down the camshaft actuator bolts, I'm going to go ahead and torque this cover down. It gets torqued down to 66 foot-pounds. It's held in with a 10mm hex head, Allen key, whatever you're going to call it. Now if you're reusing yours, you do want to apply a sealant. This one I should have showed you earlier, but you can probably see if you look back. Already has a thread sealer applied. Also there's a crush sealing washer on this, so you got to make sure that's on there. Should be good to go. So now we need to do the camshaft actuator bolts. Both of these get torqued down to 22 foot-pounds with an additional 100 degrees of rotation. So I think earlier I said there was a tool to hold the camshafts while you installed the chain. I was actually wrong. I was thinking of some other engines. The tool for this engine holds the camshafts in place while you torque the bolts, which is helpful. I don't have the tool, so I'm just going to try using a wrench on the part of the cam while we torque it down. We'll see how that goes. I may need to upgrade to a bigger wrench. One thing I did forget to do was oil the bolts before I put them in, so I'm just going to give them a dab of oil before I torque them down. Now again, you want to use new bolts for these. These are torque to yield. If you reuse the bolts, you're not going to get the right amount of clamping force, and they could back out, which is a bad day. So we're going to start by torquing these up to 22 foot-pounds. Now I'm going to mark vertically on both of these bolts, just so we get a rough idea of how we did on the angle torque. If I didn't mention it earlier, these are 18mm headed bolts. I'm going to rotate this just so it's easier for me to see the angle measurement. Oh, well, that's not going to be. Whatever. Okay, now we're going to go for 100 degrees. Okay, there's 100. Now we're just going to repeat the same on this side. Wrench slipped off there. It looks like we just made it, so actually we have a little bit ways to go. Let's see, we're at 90. We need to grab a bigger wrench. Alright, this is the widest wrench that'll fit on the flats. It's okay. Just throw a pipe over it. Just a little bit more leverage. We just have a little bit more to go on this thing. There we are. Okay, so you can see how that holding tool is nice, but you can do it with just a wrench. Now that we've got the actuator bolts torqued up, we should be good to go on the timing front. Now let's turn our attention to the timing cover. Alright, so here's the timing cover. You can see there's the front crank seal up here. You always want to replace this if you have the chance. Especially this engine, it was leaking pretty bad. So we have the chance now, we're going to do it. The oil pump is crankshaft driven right here. There's an eccentric. I guess you could call it an eccentric. There's two flaps on the crank that turn the oil pump. So it gets in the way a little bit of the seal, but to knock it out, we're going to get a screwdriver or a punch, try to stick it in here and hammer it out. I'm going to set it on these 2 wood blocks just so it's supported. So you want to be hammering on the hard part of the seal, but obviously not damaging the sealing surface. Just like that, comes out. You can see how brittle this seal was. Not ideal. You want these to be nice and flexible. So it's a good thing we're replacing it. Oh, you couldn't even see it. You can see the seal is a little brittle. It's not horrible, but it's definitely good we're replacing it. Comes out easy. We're going to want to clean up its bore. Here's our new seal. See, it fits in nicely. Obviously it's going to need hammered in place. Comes with this cover. I'm not entirely sure if you're supposed to hammer on it. Guess we can give it a go. See, there's a little lip that sticks up. And then inside it's a Teflon seal. Alright, I'm going to use the dead blow on this. And I'm going to grab a socket that's big enough for that. You can get a special tool that kind of slots in there, but a socket works if you have a big enough one. And as it turns out, I do not have a big enough socket, so we're just going to keep trying this. I'm going to switch over to this just because it's a little smaller. Getting there. Just want to make sure you're even all the way around. Feels like we are. Seal still looks undamaged. So we can call it good. Alright, so I went ahead and cleaned up the cover surface with some Scotch-Brite, and then I gave it a really good clean with the air gun. So I'm just going to wipe this down to get rid of any oil on it. Not that it's a huge deal. We're not using RTV to seal. It's a rubber seal. So it should be okay, but may as well make sure it's clean. Then put the gasket on. Now's our last chance to check everything over. And we're still looking good everywhere. You can see all the bolts that were torqued. So we should be good to get the cover on. Here you can say clean the surface. This oil varnish isn't a huge deal. You could go crazy and clean it, I guess, if you wanted to, but I don't. I do need to pop this bolt out. And we've got 2 dowel pins that hold it in place. Then we have 11 total bolts. Luckily, all of these are the same length, and then this is just a longer water pump bolt. Alright, all these bolts get torqued to 18 foot-pounds. There's no sequence, but you want to do it fairly even. The service manual does say to do the center bolt last. These are all 10mm headed. This last one is 13mm. But it also gets torqued down to 18 foot-pounds. Alright, next we can get the belt tensioner on. This thing was pretty grimy. I gave it a good cleaning with degreaser, but you can see it's still a little stained. This is a 15mm bolt that gets torqued to 33 foot-pounds. Next we can install our balancer. Harmonic damper, I guess it is. It's not actually a balancer. Harmonic damper. Just gotta make sure the QA gets in properly. Here we are. Now you are supposed to use a new bolt and washer. I have that on order, so for now I'm just going to put in the old one, but I'm not going to torque it to spec. The torque spec is 74 foot-pounds and then an additional 125 degrees of rotation. Once you have the damper bolt torqued down, you turn it counterclockwise to engage the chain tensioner, and then you should be good to go. I forgot to mention you can also release the chain tensioner by pushing against the tensioner guide. You can just get a long-handled screwdriver or something and tap it that way, and that'll release the lock within the tensioner and cause it to pull up the tension. But anyways, it's a good idea to go ahead and rotate the engine around a few times. Make sure that you're not hitting anything. If you feel any resistance, like a hard stop or anything, you want to not force it, because that could be valves hitting pistons, and you don't want to bend valves without the engine even running. That'd be unfortunate. You can also bring piston number 1 back around to top dead center. Looks like I overshot it a little bit. Should be about there. I went a little far, but you can see that the cams are still in their approximate position, and additionally we got 16 links, counting the links above the arrows, between the arrows. That's exactly what we want, so we should be good on this front. So now I'm going to go ahead and get the spark plugs in, just so that we're sure nothing falls down into the cylinders. You can see I actually started getting one in here. It's not a bad idea to use a little bit of anti-seize or never seize, or whatever you want to call it. I like to just take a little dab and put it right under the ground strap. Like that. You don't need a lot. You know, I'm going to change to a normal socket. I'm using Autolite Platinums just because they were cheap on Rock Auto, and I always use Autolites because I've never had a problem with them. You could gap these if you want to. I'm just comparing them to each other, making sure they look okay. Alright, so now we can get the valve cover on. Before we do that, I am going to give all of the cam lobes a little bit of oil, just to pre-lube them a little bit. I have our new seal pressed into the valve cover here. I also blew it out really well with the blowgun. You probably saw there's a lot of oil varnish in here. It's not going to hurt it, and I didn't want to go crazy cleaning it. You could if you wanted to. So you just want to make sure the gasket's seated fully into its groove. Looks good. It sets down into place just like that. And I'll go grab all the bolts. Alright, the camshaft cover was taken off before I actually bought it, because I bought this, actually it was sitting at a mechanic shop, and they had taken off the cam cover to diagnose and found that the timing chain was bad. So all the bolts were just kind of laying on top of the engine. Hopefully we have them all. Guess we're about to find out. If not, I did grab some from the junkyard, so not a huge deal. Yeah, it looks like we're missing a couple. So luckily I grabbed some from the junkyard. We're good to go here. Looks like we got them all. These get torqued to 89 inch-pounds, just like the other 10mm headed bolts. Not a bad idea to work your way around. Looks like this is too long of a bolt. Bottoming out. Let me go check out what other bolts I have from the junkyard. Yeah, that bolt must have come from somewhere else. So we should be good with this one. I think these ones actually are the wrong bolts too. They're a little long. But they're not blind holes, so it wouldn't have been a huge deal. Never mind. Maybe they just stick out a little bit. Alright, now all the perimeter bolts are torqued down, we can get the coils in. Do need to get the VVT solenoid bolts in as well. I don't know what it is, but I feel like every modern engine I rebuild, it's happened, I don't know, 3-4 times. I have to replace at least one of the coils. I don't know if they go bad from sitting, or I don't know what the deal is, but we'll see what happens with this, I guess. These also are torqued to 89 inch-pounds. I think I mentioned earlier that I accidentally sent this rear head cover in with the head core, because this is a remanufactured head I got through my local machine shop. So I was able to get one from the junkyard. See, it's a little grimy, and unfortunately the head gasket kit I have didn't come with this gasket, and it's not in the greatest of shape. So I'm going to put it on. Luckily this is easy to replace in the car, so I'll probably order one and we can get to that when we can. I'm going to give this a quick clean up and then we'll get it on. 89 inch-pounds for these as well. While we're over here, let's get our new oil filter installed. Grab a rag, make sure that's all clean down there. Here's our new oil filter. I actually like these cartridge filters quite a bit. It's easy to tell if there's debris in them and what kind of metal you got going on. And we also have this new sealing O-ring for the cap to install. And you can see we want this tip down. Sits in there with a little O-ring. This is actually a complete guess, but it's actually a 32. Obviously it doesn't need to be crazy tight, you just get it snug. That's good to go. Starting to look like an engine again. I'm also going to go ahead and install the VVT solenoid bolts. These get 89 inch-pounds just like everything else. Alright, so since this is a direct injection engine, the injectors have these one-time use Teflon seals that you have to replace every time you remove the injectors. Luckily our head gasket set came with some new ones. They look a little bit different, but hopefully they'll still work okay. You do need a special tool to install these, because they're kind of a pain to slip over. I got this is a really cheap one off Amazon. We're going to see if it works. If it does, I'll link it down below for you guys, because it's way cheaper than the OEM tool. You just got to cut off the old seals. I'm going to give these a good cleaning. Alright, that seems pretty good. Open up our new seals. Now there are another set of seals up top. I am not going to disturb it because I don't need to, but I believe that's what these white spacers are for. So you can see here's one of our new Teflon seals. Compared to the old ones, it's a little narrower, so we'll see, I don't know. Alright, so these are all different sizes for different injectors. We just need to find the one that fits on ours. Looks like this one's it. Alright, so we're just going to take this cone, put it on there, the new seal on. I've got this weird pusher tool, I guess, so we'll just use that to push the seal on. We got the seals in place. You can see it's really sloppy. It's going to need resized. Get our second one on now. Alright, well, they're on now. Okay, so now we use this resizing tool, I guess, to try and get the seals resized, squished back down into place. And we just ruined that seal, so that's awesome. Wonder if I should be using a smaller cone. That's probably what it is. That other one was too big, huh? Yeah. Alright, well, let's try this injector and see if we have better results. Well, that seal's now good now too. Let's see if we can. I mean, we're already having to buy a new seal kit, so at this point we're just learning, right? Huh. Seems like we maybe got that one to work. You can see it's back down to its correct size. See if we can get the other ones to work. Now that seal's ruined now too. That's awesome. Kinda worked. Kinda just smushed the seal. I'm not even positive these are the right seals, because you can see the thickness difference. So yeah, I'm not sure. We got a couple more to screw up, so let's get those a go. Just ruined that one. Yeah, that one's not gonna work either. So, yeah, I don't know if this tool is just not very good, or if it's incorrect, or maybe I'm just using it incorrectly. But as it is, we're gonna need to buy a whole new set of seals. I think maybe what we'll do is just continue getting the engine ready to get back into the car. We have to put the intake manifold on with the engine inside the car anyway, so we can always put this in with the engine in place. So I think next I will put the exhaust manifold on. I took the whole engine out with the exhaust manifold in place, so I figure I'll put it on before. This will just make things easier. Now, it is super common on these 2.4 Ecotecs for the exhaust manifold to crack. You can see I've got a crack right here. I was going to either try to weld or braze this crack, but I was able to get a replacement manifold. I think it's Dorman branded for, I think it was under $100, so it's well worth it to just do that. And supposedly it's a little bit of a thicker casting. So here's the new one. I was seeing in the reviews that you may have to trim down some of these, but we'll see. We'll get the studs in and then go from there. These take an E7 E-Torx. And if you're weird like me and are going to use a torque wrench on these, they get torqued down to 89 inch-pounds. Got our new gasket here. Looks pretty good. The manifold came with some oil in here to prevent rusting, so I'm just going to wipe it off. I mean, it's going to burn off anyways, but might as well. And let's see if we're going to have to modify it. No, looks like it went right on there. Cool. I am going to go ahead and hit all of these studs with some never sees, anti-seize, whatever. Okay, the service manual does give a sequence that the manifold is supposed to be torqued at, and it gets torqued to 124 inch-pounds. The service manual also says to replace the bolts, but I'm not going to. I'm guessing maybe it's because these are kind of those oval locking nuts. But we'll see. Maybe I'll regret not replacing them. Although it's not a bad job at all they do in the car. Should be good to go on that. Alright, I did just realize I forgot that we need to put the new crank bolt in. I was able to get this delivered next day. Or no, it wasn't next day. I got it pretty quick on Amazon. I'll throw it in the description for you guys. You can also get it from your dealer probably. But so I'm just going to give this a light coat of oil. Should be good. And a little bit between the head of the bolt and the washer. So this bolt is going to have a ton of torque on it. It gets torqued to 74 foot-pounds and then an additional, I think it's like 120 degrees or something. I'll have to double check. So there is a special tool you can get that's a holder fixture, and it bolts onto here, I believe. I don't have that, but there is a trick I pretty much always use when I'm building an engine to torque the crank bolt. So what I do is I take a couple of the old flex plate bolts, and yes, we have to replace it on this engine, and I'll thread them in or drop them to opposite holes on the crank. Oop. It's a little tricky when it's on a stand. And you want some pretty decent thread engagement, because we're going to be putting a lot of torque on these. I just wedge a pry bar, which looks like we might need to turn the engine a little bit. Or move one of the bolts. Let's see, you gotta tighten this way. Yeah, let's move this bolt here, that might make it easier. There we go. Alright, so now set the pry bar there. I'm just going to rotate the engine like we're tightening the crank bolt until it hits. There we go. And now we should be good to torque up the crank bolt. Alright, so the first step is 74 foot-pounds. Right there. I'm going to mark the very top of the bolt, just like we did on the head bolts, just to get a general idea of how far we've turned it. Okay, and then now we're going to go an additional 125 degrees. So we'll just zero out angle meter. I'm going to use my torque wrench because it's the longest ratchet I got. I'm just going to turn it way up so that it doesn't click. There's 120. And 125. So you can see it gets torqued pretty tight, but our little setup in the back held up just fine. Now we'll just rotate it back down with the pry bar. Take it out and we're good to go. So now we've got the engine to a point basically where it's ready to get dropped in. We do have to leave the intake manifold off just so that we can put it back in through the top, because I removed it through the top. I don't have a lift. I would have liked to have been able to put the injectors in, but you know, I got to order new seals, so we'll be doing that next time. Yeah, we made a lot of progress. We got the whole long block together. So I guess I'll see you guys next time when we get this into the car. Catch you later.